There are two main events in the Patriots' War as it relates to northern New York. The first was the burning of the British steamer Sir Robert Peel in the Thousand Island region by Bill Johnston in the spring of 1838. The second was the expedition which culminated in the tragic Battle of the Windmill, which sent a number of Jefferson, Lewis and St. Lawrence County men to their deaths, and others to exile in the British penal colony, the dreaded Van Diemen's Land, now called Tasmania. There is no more fascinating or romantic chapter in the history of northern New York than the Patriots' War. Though properly a part of the history of Canada, the United States, particularly northern New York, played an active part in it. One of the most interesting features of the Patriot War relative to northern New York was the formation of what was known as Hunters' Lodges. The lodges extended from Montreal on the east to the Detroit River on the west. As many as 100,000 men were members of the secret order of Hunters' Lodges. Practically every village in the northern country had a lodge, composed of those who were in sympathy with the struggles that the Canadians were making for their liberty. They were willing to risk their lives and fortunes that Canada might become independent of Great Britain, and to quote from the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, to assume that separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitles them. The rebellion was insignificant from a military point of view, but it was a tremendous political upheaval, and it resulted in a much larger measure of self-government being granted by the Crown to Canada. This is a report from Aaron Dresser, the third Aaron in a series of this Dresser family. Aaron was also one of the prisoners of the Battle of the Windmill, and was eventually sent to exile on Van Diemen's Land. His sentence was for 7 years, but he and a partner helped capture a violent escaped prisoner after about 5 years had been served, and earned a passage home and commutation of their sentence as a reward. Home was identified as England, which may have been home to the jailers, but was certainly not home to the jailed. Aaron Dresser and his fellow ex-prisoner made it to London, but Aaron's health was broken. The American ambassador, Edward Everett I believe, kindly nursed them in his own home and used their stories of life in Van Diemen's Land to argue for release of the other exiled patriots. He was also able to arrange passage for the two back to New York City, where they were met with a hero's welcome. A letter written by the two was published in the New York daily newspapers and is said to have helped pressure the American government to renew efforts for the return of the prisoners. Aaron Dresser was born on 24th April 1816 and died 18th of May 1855, leaving a wife and 3 young children born after his return. He is buried in the Old Teresa Cemetery in Jefferson County, New York. The following is an excerpt from William Lyon Mackenzie's Flight After the Battle of Windmill. The resource is a newspaper clipping from the Town of Orleans Archives, Lafargeville, New York. John W. Little of Cape Vincent, New York, was the Hunter Lodge secretary and Underground Railway depot master in Cape Vincent, New York. The following is an untold story of William Lyon Mackenzie's flight from Canada, handed down among descendants of John W. Little. John W. Little was born in Scotland in 1807. He died in 1892. His wife was Elizabeth Philomela Dickey, born 1814, died 1892. Elizabeth relates incidents as a participant. The original transcript was in the possession of Mrs. Harriet T. Montague, her great-granddaughter at the time. Mackenzie entered Canadian political strife as editor of the Colonial Advocate at New York, Toronto, in the 1820s, bitterly attacking the dominance of United Empire Loyalists. Elected to the legislature 5 times, once by every vote of his district but 1 vote, he was each time expelled until seated by the new government. He became the first mayor of Toronto in 1834 and 3 years later engaged in the revolutionary preparations leading to an armed encounter between the Patriots and militia on December 5, 1837. The story of Mackenzie's flight after the battle at Windmill, as told by Elizabeth Dickey Little on her golden wedding anniversary to her granddaughter Harriet Antoinette Terry, records an important incident in his stormy life not contained in most accounts on Mackenzie. John W. Little, the great-grandfather, was a member of the group of Americans who furnished arms and ammunition to the Canadian Patriots and subsequently aided slaves to Canada. As secretary of the Hunters' Lodge, he kept up correspondences with General Niels Zolterecki von Schultz. Mrs. Little told her children that von Schultz's writing was like a copper plate engraving.
Of these writers, she said, one who escaped from Canada came to the little home and was hidden in the partition when officers came. Von Schultz was condemned and hanged in the ditch of the moat at Fort Henry, Kingston, a fact that determines the fugitive as Mackenzie. The carpenters were putting up a closet when the search was made, their presence aiding in concealing the liberator Mackenzie. Next day, Mackenzie donned the dress of Molly Brown Dickey Little, who was visiting at Cape Vincent, and accompanied by Elizabeth Little and her 13-month-old baby, Mackenzie, thus disguised, set out in a 2-seated carriage, ostensibly for Henderson Harbour, former home of Molly Little. Mackenzie left on the way, Mrs. Little told her children, without revealing the details of his leave-taking.
The animosities caused by the border warfare in 1812 had not died down, and when Papineau and Mackenzie, the gifted leader of the revolt in Upper Canada, came to Watertown, Truax allied himself with one of the Hunters' lodges and attended the almost nightly meetings. He joined the ill-fated expedition that set out to capture Prescott and probably embarked at Sackett's Harbour or Clayton. At any rate, he was among those who followed the brave von Schultz, and he landed on Canadian soil. From 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, he once said, in telling his experiences, we fought, and when the British were ordered to charge bayonets, you should have seen us Yankees run. We had no javelins on our rifles. We had about half a mile to run to reach the windmill. We'd gone about 10 rods, approximately 160 feet, when we came to a high rail fence. I had just scaled it and was but a few feet away when one of the militia rushed up, rested his rifle on the top rail and fired at me. This man jumped the fence and was about to push his bayonet through me when a British regular came up and pushed him away, claiming me as his prisoner. With the other captives I was marched to a temporary fort where my wounds were dressed, and the next morning we were put on a ship and taken to Kingston. We were stowed away in the forecastle without much room and no place to sit or lie down. We were in damp quarters and had nothing to eat, and it was a discouraged and miserable lot of boys and men who comprised the passenger list of that boat. On arriving at Kingston, we were taken to Fort Henry, where we were confined about 6 months. We were tried before the Judge Advocate of Upper Canada on the charge of causing the death of Her Majesty's subjects. We all pleaded not guilty, but of course we were found guilty and were sent back to the fort, where we remained several months more. There we saw our less fortunate comrades marched out to the gallows. I think that 13 in all, the officers and leaders of the expedition, were executed, including the brave Colonel von Schultz and a number of Watertown and Jefferson County men. Queen Victoria took pity on the very young men of the party, of whom there were 33, including myself, and she pardoned us, and we were allowed to return to our homes. Over 150 of the older ones, however, were transported to Van Diemen's Land. After being pardoned, Mr. Truax returned to Watertown and resumed his trade of a harness maker, and then went to Antwerp. Later he returned to Watertown. Michael II, together with 85 others, was captured, tried, and their sentence was execution. Then follows an astonishing petition written by 42 fellow countrymen, pleading for clemency for Michael II. This is the text of the petition of the sundry inhabitants of the district of Talbot.
Humbly showeth that your petitioners have learned with deep regret that Michael Fraer, late of the town of Clay, county of Onondaga, state of New York, who some 2 or 3 years ago laboured for a few months in the town of Simcoe, in said district at the trade of a cooper, was amongst the brigands taken at Prescott and is now confined in the prison at Kingston. That your petitioners, while they duly reprobate the wickedness and depravity of those who set on foot that vile expedition, cannot but feel commiseration for those unsuspecting and inexperienced youths who, not enjoying the guardian care of friends to advise them for their good, were easily made the dupes and victims of vicious and designing men. That the only surviving parent of Michael Fraer, who emigrated to the province from the state of New York with several of her children, has for some years past resided in this district, and thus leaving the said Michael Fraer, who is but a youth, destitute of those kind restraints which should be ever exercised by the guardian of a family over its respective members. That during the few months he resided in Simcoe, your petitioners did not observe in him any manifestation of a vindictive or wicked disposition. On the contrary, they considered him an inoffensive youth, much more liable to be the dupe of artifice than a leader in mischief. Your petitioners therefore humbly conceive that, under the circumstances above mentioned, he is a more fit subject for executive clemency than would he have been had he possessed mature years of discretion, influence in society, or the salutary advice and restraints of his friends. And they confidently trust that the compunction and remorse he must feel for his crime will ever prevent him from being again engaged in so base an enterprise. Your petitioners therefore humbly pray that your Excellency will grant the royal mercy to the said Michael Fraer. Signed, Talbot District, 24th June 1839, by Duncan Campbell and 41 others. Clemency was not granted. However, letters flowed between the Governor of Canada and the British government, and the sentence of execution was commuted to banishment to the colonies. In 1839, the prisoners were put aboard the ship Buffalo, which sailed for Diemen's Land, Tasmania, from Quebec at the end of September 1839, and arrived at Port Hobart, Tasmania, 12th of February 1840. Once there, the men were organised into gangs and set to work building roads in the new colony. Conditions on the voyage out and subsequent harsh working conditions took its toll on the men's health, and several did not survive. The following is the transcript of the actual convict record, which my father and I discovered on the microfiche at the archives in Hobart. Fraer, Michael, transported for piratical invasion of Upper Canada. On the Buffalo, 12th of February 1840. No jail or hulk list received. Stated this offence. Province of Upper Canada. Piratical invasion of Upper Canada, single. 10th December 1938. Life. 11th of November 1840. Poole. Destroying his slop clothing and saying he wanted a trial with insolence to Mr. Poole. 3 days solitary confinement. Signed, Poole. 102:42, March 17th, 1843. Knowingly and maliciously supplying unwholesome provisions to the Ross chain gang, committed for trial. Free pardon 1st of July 1845.
The Hobart Town Courier of 14th February 1840 reported the arrival of the Buffalo with 140 prisoners aboard, convicted of being concerned in the recent disturbances in the Canadas. Of these, 83, one dies, were designed for Van Diemen's Land, the remainder to be forwarded to Sydney. How were the involuntary immigrants feeling? On their disembarkation, one observer commented that most of the Americans were very respectable people. The state of emaciation and of destitution of the poor unfortunates was extreme. In spite of our own distress, we recognised that they were still more unfortunate than ourselves. Then too, we found in our faith, resources and consolation which were lacking to the majority. Before the Americans were disembarked, their descriptions were minutely recorded, and they were interviewed by Gunn, the superintendent of convicts. Eustace's narrative suggests that they were landed in Hobart Town itself and taken to the ordinary prisoners' barracks, but the other narratives are in agreement how a large crowd gathered to see the landing of the rebel Yankees. To a great many people of that country, we were almost as great an object of wonderment as were the followers of Cortes to the simple-minded Aztecs. There was considerable surprise that the Americans were white and appeared to speak English. When they landed, the ground heaved, rolled and tumbled about us at a fearful rate. Gates says that they were bothered for 2 or 3 weeks with this phantom movement of the earth. They were issued with standard convict clothing, not magpie, of trousers, jacket, 2 shirts, skullcap, shoes, and no socks. As Snow put it, at Sandy Bay we were divested of our threadbare garments and enrobed in nice suits of domestic manufacture, got up after the latest improved convict fashion. When we were thus accoutred, we looked so grotesque that we would not help bursting into a roar of laughter. Snow could afford an attempt at humour. He had just vented his spleen against the island of Van Diemen's Land and its ex-lieutenant governor. We are told that Rome owed its greatness to the asylum it first offered to fugitives, vagabonds, outlaws. These, at Rome, became lawful citizens, and we are sure that at no time could Rome show a more disparate crowd of ruffians than has constituted the convict population of Van Diemen's Land since its settlement by the English. It is the opinion of all who were acquainted with his administration here that Pharaoh of Egypt established a more moderate system of police and governed the children of Israel with greater lenity than was manifested the scourge of the human race, Arthur, towards his subjects. March describes Sandy Bay Station as consisting of 8 or 9 pine huts, 10 or 12 feet in length, fastened at the bottom to logs or sleepers and thatched roughly. As Wright put it, giving us the benefit of rather free circulation of air. March says that there were fireplaces only in the overseers' huts. The huts would contain from 10 to 50 men, with 2-tier berths all round, and there was no floor. The station was built in a square, leaving a yard in front for the men in which to muster. March adds that huts at the other road stations were similarly constructed. Gates says, however, that wherever chain gangs were or had been kept, the huts were built of stone. He describes the bedding as consisting of 1 coarse cotton rug and a coarse blanket. The highlight of their first day at Sandy Bay was the visit of the Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Franklin. Says March, "We expected after hearing Governor Franklin's splendid speech that the old reprobate was death on the Yankees, and were afterwards fully convinced of the fact. He is dressed in full uniform, no doubt feeling highly honoured to address so many Americans. We were informed that he devoured a sheep each meal, and on occasion 2. Gates described how they were mustered and instructed in the mysteries of that etiquette which behoved men of low degree to observe in the presence of those who, clothed with British power, have therefore a right to lord it over God's heritage and their fellow men." Sir John was all flesh and blubber, and by his inflated manner indicated the supreme bliss he felt in thus having an opportunity of addressing a company of Americans. Gates claims that Franklin took 2 hours to say what any American schoolboy could have said in 20 minutes. It seems that the substance of Sir John's address was that they were all bad men, guilty of a heinous crime, and that the simple French have been incited to a rebellion by the bad Yankees, but good conduct would be rewarded. By Snow's account, it seems that Franklin clearly stated that they had been sent out to the colony under circumstances without precedent, and that he was not certain of what was the pleasure of the home government in disposing of them, and declaring that he would write immediately to Lord Russell on the subject. Woodman recorded that on the 17th instant Sir John Franklin made a visit. He addressed us in a very mild manner and also gave us good advice. All the others thought they had been subjected to an harangue. The next morning we were sent out to the different road stations to work on our enormous taxes. Here too we were put upon a rigid course of dietetics. Were you to have seen our daily rations, you would have taken us for the tenants of a hospital for the cure of dyspepsia. Our food was uniformly of the lightest kind, not in the least hard of digestion. Sir John, in the plenitude of his benevolence, wished us to expend all our energies in macadamizing our ways, not in digesting English luxuries. The poor quality and small amount of the food is one issue upon which all the narrative writers agree. While the figures quoted as being the rations issued to them do not indicate a starvation diet, it must be kept in mind that on this unvaried diet the men had to do a long and hard day's work, and that some of them were used to the richer fare of the farmhouse. March quotes the rations as being 1.5 pounds of bread, 2 ounces of flour per man, made into skilly, a thin broth or gruel, measured out to each 1 pint, 1 pound of mutton, which once boiled weighed less, plus gruel in the evenings. Gates quotes the rations as being 1 to 1.5 pounds of bread, 1 pint of skilly in the morning and evening, and now and then a very stinted luxury of a little vegetable food, as turnips or cabbage. Eustace says they had 1 pound 5 ounces of coarse bread, 3/4 of a pound of fresh meat, half a pound of potatoes, 1 to 2 ounces of salt, 2 ounces of flour for skilly in the morning and the same at night. This was the daily ration for each man, from one end of the year to the other. The meat was boiled or half boiled, and the broth served us to drink. From a pint of this broth it was frequently no difficult matter to scrape a spoonful of maggots. Apropos of Eustace's maggots, it is interesting to note that they all comment on the seemingly large size and numbers of flies in Van Diemen's Land as compared with the United States. On life at Sandy Bay Station, Woodman is quite informative. We are only allowed Saturday afternoon from labour, and it takes about all of this time to wash our clothes and clean up. Our labour is of the hardest kind on the roads. All the earth has to be removed by handcarts and barrows. We are on labour late and early, and but one what you could call a good meal in 24 hours. Woodman does have the generosity to admit, "I plainly see that the authorities would do more to relieve us from the heavy burden we labour under, but it seems out of their power, the laws governing prisoners being made by the home government." Wright goes into more detail about their actual labour and the terrible overseers. The prisoners were harnessed 4 to a cart and had to pull from 15 to 18 hundredweight in loads over broken ground of about 1 mile, and were expected to do 13 loads per day. Those who did not draw carts broke stone. Southern slavery in its worst form would have been a paradise to the infernal caprices to which we were ever subjected. The inimitable Mr. Marsh claims that hundreds and thousands were worked and starved to death. The doctors got their bodies for dissection. But Mr. Wright, who worked as an attendant at the hospital for about 4 months after hurting his shoulder, emphasised that convict corpses were bundled together and buried like so many carrion carcasses. Soon after their arrival, it had been made compulsory for them to attend St. George's Church every Sunday morning. They had hoped to have their Sundays off. Gates described how they were mustered, formed into double rank, and marched off to church to hear the detested ritual of the Church of England, the purgatory of 2 and 3 long doleful hours, rising, kneeling and sitting, according to the most precise formula, all the while holding our faces, as grave as an owl, on the Reverend Mr. Bedford. Like the greater portion of Her Majesty's hirelings, Bedford loved the bottle more than the Lord. The Colonial Times reported in 1840 of the transportees. We learn that the Canadian political convicts are men of both good sense and good conduct, and are anything but in their proper position in gangs on the public road. These extracts were taken from the convicts' personal descriptions of their treatment and conditions under the British government, from research detailed on the internet. The text on the Cabarita Park monument reads, Canadian Exiles of 1840. Near the spot in Longbottom Stockade, 58 French-speaking Canadian prisoners from the uprising of 1837 to 1838 in Lower Canada were incarcerated from March 11, 1840 to November 1842 before being released on ticket of leave and eventually pardoned to return to Canada. Their sojourn in the Parramatta River area is recalled by the names of Exile Bay, France Bay and Canada Bay. This plaque was unveiled on May 19, 1970 by the Right Honourable Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, to mark the 130th anniversary of the landing of the Canadian exiles in Australia, and to commemorate the sacrifices made by many Canadians and Australians in the evolution of self-government, equal and free nations within the Commonwealth of Nations.
Another small monument is located in the grounds of the Victoria Barracks in Sydney. It was dedicated during Australia's bicentenary in 1988 and acknowledges the Patriots' association with the construction of the barracks in 1840. The plaque reads, In memory of the Canadian Patriots exiled in New South Wales from 1840 to 1844, a number of whom assisted in the construction of Victoria Barracks, unveiled by the Honourable Don Matsankowski, Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, July 6, 1988, Canadian Exiles Monument, Sydney. The 1837-1838 rebellion led the British government of the day ultimately to adopt remedial measures leading to the evolution of responsible government and parliamentary democracy in Canada. These principles were incorporated in both countries' constitutions and ultimately the establishment of Canada's Confederation in 1867 and Australia's Federation in 1901. A record of this remarkable colonial exploit was written by François Maurice Le Paleur, whose diary of the events, established as Land of 1,000 Sorrows, is held in the collection of the National Library of Australia. Within 5 years, the Government of Canada had a change of heart. The exiled men were unconditionally pardoned and even begged to return home to Canada. The remnant, -6, took advantage of this generous reprieve and went back. There is also a monument in Hobart Harbour containing the names of the 86, and Michael Fraer's name is there. He was one of the 6 who remained.